Hello and welcome to episode 46 of Question and Answer. And I must say, I had no idea I'd ever be doing 46 of these, but here I am doing 46 of these. And I must say that things have changed a bit since the last episode that I did out on the back porch with the dogs and such, because just last Tuesday, I asked my sweetheart to marry me, and she said yes. So now I'm officially engaged. Also, I might be getting a different job at a different sheet metal shop soon, which will pay more than $5 an hour more than the last place, which is nice, especially considering that I'm going to have a wife um, within the next year or so. We haven't We haven't officially set a date yet, although I think it's going to be next year because my sweetie is superstitious about odd-numbered years. Bovine glandular secretions. So I guess we might as well get to it because there's lots of questions again this time, and I'm seriously considering doing one of these once a week now because the number of questions has increased somewhat. Last number 45, my Peach 45 edition, it was getting up towards 3 hours. So let's just get in on this. Let's just get started here. So the first question is from Aurelian. He asked this question before I published the last Q&A, but I'd already recorded it. So this one's kind of an old one. Let's hope it hasn't expired. And Aurelian says, how should Navakavadins take refuge? For now it would be based Buddhists on the internet self-initiating unless they are able to make contact with legit monks somehow. Do you have thoughts about a more organized approach for accepting new members into the movement at some point? Politically incorrect Pali names when? Well, Navakavada, I mean, it's always been I've considered it to be a good idea. My friend Otto kind of took the name Navakavada and ran with it. And he's got a Navakavada channel on BitChute. But I guess you take refuge the same way that any other Buddhist would take refuge. If you've got a legit monk, as Aurelian says, you can take refuge before the legit monk, in his presence. If not, I mean, just if you've got an altar, you can just, squat down in front of the altar, bow down, and take the refuge there. The three refuges, Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, would be the traditional way of doing it. Do I have thoughts about a more organized approach for accepting new members? Well, this is just sort of a spontaneous thing. It's just there's not really a membership list or anything like that. There's no application forms or anything. You just feel like you want to be one at present. I mean, maybe someday it'll become like an organized movement, but at present it's just sort of floating around in the air. Politically incorrect Pali names. I'll have to start thinking up politically incorrect Pali names. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about this. Because, I mean, even when I was a monk, things were taking off slow. And maybe I should have turned my phone off or something. Even when I was a monk, things were going really slow. And now that I'm a lay person, a householder, if you will, I've got to work for a living. I got less time and energy for doing like live Dhamma talks and so forth. Although it's still a possibility, but I got bills to pay now. So, I mean, you get enough people that are interested, you get like what do you call it? The critical mass, and things can take off. But it's such like a fringe movement. Like most Western Buddhists are like leftists, and they're really not interested in traditionalism, and they just ignore Asian traditionalists as though there are few Buddhists of color in the West. You read about this a lot in their literature. We need more Buddhists of color when they're just completely ignoring all the Southeast Asian immigrants and Sri Lankan immigrants and so forth. So anyway, I suppose I should just move on to the next question after sort of answering that one. And this is from Arain. And Arain says, what is the absolute bottom barrel worst debauched karma one can generate? And what is the absolute worst karmic consequence of doing so? Well, according to Theravadan tradition, there are 5 actions that if you perpetrate any of these 5, you are guaranteed of hell in your next existence. One is to make a Buddha bleed. You can't kill a fully enlightened Buddha, but you can hurt one enough so that he bleeds. And so that's one. And I don't know, like someone's shaving the Buddha's head and accidentally nick him. I think they might get like a pass on that one or something. Next is to kill an arahant, kill a fully enlightened being. Hell is the consequence. Third is to kill your mother or father. And by golly, I think I might be forgetting what one of these, let's see. One of them is to start a schism. That's the 5th one. And for some reason, I can't think of what the 4th one is. Although the 5th one is, I mean, sometimes there's an alternative to creating a schism, which may be good news for some of the early Mahayana monks who may or may not be roasting in Avicii hell right now. And that is to rape or seduce a nun. But why don't I remember? See, to make a Buddha bleed, to kill an arahant, to kill one of your own parents. Maybe 3 and 4 would be mother or father, but I don't think so. And then maybe it's just 4. Heck, I don't know. My memory is not perfect. But those are like the worst things you can do from a traditional Theravada Buddhist point of view. And I mean, if your parents are awful, I mean, that's still no excuse because they did bring you into this world. Um, so, and then the absolute worst karmic consequence would be just the lowest hell, which is called Avicii hell. Literally, Avicii means without waves. You know, it's just still. There's no breeze. There's nothing. You know, it's just still blazing heat with like glowing iron floors and walls and demons and so forth. And you stay there for a very long time. And I mean, just as sort of a digression, I've always had my skeptical doubts about how someone could commit an action so bad in a lifetime of 70, 80, 90 years that they could do enough badness in that limited time to stay in hell in utter torment for literally millions and millions of years. It doesn't last forever in Buddhism. Heaven doesn't last forever either. You know, once you've exhausted your karma, you know, you pass away from that place and appear somewhere else. But I used to wonder about that. And then um, I think it was when there was just this heat wave going on in central Burma, which is hot anyway, even without heat waves. And it's just, you get into such a foul mood sometimes. I mean, any of you who have read Somerset Maugham, you may know about how this tropical heat can just get to people, or Rudyard Kipling also. Like he has a short story called The End of the Passage about 2 people who just crack up and die just because of the heat in India. Um, and now oh yeah, so it could be that when you're in hell, you're so miserable that you're just cursing the universe, cursing yourself, and it's just this perpetual foul, foul mood to say the least, and just really negative mental states that just keeps you there. That's my theory anyway. But just to sort of recap Arian's question here, my answer to it, I mean, is the worst karma you can generate: make a Buddha bleed, kill an arahant, kill one of your parents, start a schism, and maybe also rape or seduce a nun. And the worst karmic consequence is the lowest hell realm, which is Avicii hell, that is really super icky and lasts millions of years. So the next question is from Birch. And Birch says, do you find that people on your Q&A ask too many technical philosophical questions and not enough practical ones? Or is it Or is that just par for the course? Maybe it's me. I've spent a lot of time studying religion rather than practicing it. It is perhaps a common human quality. Yeah, it's a common human quality that you want to understand. You know, you want questions answered, as the relative success of these Q&As demonstrates. Um, I don't think that people are asking too many technical philosophical questions. I kind of like technical philosophical questions. I can often answer them relatively well, I hope. So yeah, it's like any kind of questions are fair game if people want to ask that. At least they're curious about Dhamma, which is good. And it is good to have a certain, I mean, it's maybe not absolutely necessary, but it is a good thing to have like a relatively good grasp of the theory, um, in order to support the practice, to help you practice correctly. And also just as kind of a bullshit detector, as a way of kind of weeding out some of the dead wood, um, if that makes any sense. So, yeah, I'll just move on to the next question. This one is from the Arya Swasti Project. And the Arya Swasti Project says, "Greetings, Panyo. Sometimes when you are doing interviews with Brian and such, there is a photo of a thatched roof looking structure behind you. Is that a stock image, or is it one of the hermitages in Burma that you were at?" And maybe I can show a photo as a graphic. I am getting a little more ambitious with regard to showing graphics on my videos sometimes. But yeah, I actually lived there. But when I lived there long term, it wasn't as dilapidated, because in that picture, it's a palmyra leaf roof covering the front of this cave that I lived in. It was called Mandalay Gu. Gu is Burmese for cave. It's short for the Pali word guha, which means cave. And I lived there for about 3 years. It was one of the first places I lived when I went to Burma. And I had this thatched roof over the top of it. And then I went away and went, living in other places. And I came back for a visit. I think it was to do penance for Sangha Sesa offenses. And if you don't know what that means, it's fine. But I went, that monastery used to specialize in this kind of penance. And so I came back and stayed there for a few weeks, and nobody had been living there. And so the roof had become very much termite eaten and dilapidated looking. It was nicer when I lived there long term. I mean, if palmyra leaf thatch roofs are nice ever. So yeah, I did live there. It's called Mandalay Gu, and I've got a number of other pictures of it. I just use that as a background because Brian likes fake backgrounds for some reason. And it's at a monastery called Chaltsin Doya in central Burma, maybe 100 miles south of Mandalay, in Mandalay Division. So let's see. I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Andrew. And I have to admit, I do not understand this question very well. Andrew says, "I don't know, David. How can we be presented to the Buddha? How can one stand in front of the Buddha and say the shit the Viral Society stated? What the fuck would he say?" Well, I don't know exactly what being presented to the Buddha means, and I don't know what the Viral Society is. And I don't know what the Buddha would say if we were to say the shit that the Viral Society stated. Just being presented to the Buddha, he's no longer in this universe. I mean, in Theravada Buddhism, the Buddha has passed away. He is no longer in samsara. He's not like a cosmic Buddha like a lot of the Mahayana Buddhists believe in. There's no Sambhoga Kaya up in some heaven realm somewhere. But it reminds me of this doctor that I knew when I was living in Mandalay Gu, by the way. He was the local village doctor. And he spoke some English. I didn't speak much Burmese yet, so we could actually communicate a bit. And he used to pray to the Buddha. And I used to tell him, the Buddha is no longer in this world. He's no longer in any world. So what good does it do to pray to him? And he said, well, the Buddha could look into the future, and back then he could look into the future and see me praying. So I thought, well, all right. So, I mean, in that way, you can maybe be presented to the Buddha, but then I think what would have to happen is you'd have to have your, like, attention directed to the Buddha. I mean, if you've got the Buddha in your mind, in your heart, or whatever, it may be that back then he could sense that, you know, in some future age, there's going to be this person in this distant land who has his, you know, devotion directed towards me, and you know, that way he might be aware. I mean, he did have a kind of omniscience according to traditional Theravada, although it wasn't like complete omniscience like Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, is supposed to have had, where he knows all things at all times. The Buddha could just know what he wanted to know. Um, I don't know, maybe. And I have no idea what the Virel, Virel society is, so I really can't comment on that. If they said something really inappropriate, he might just remain silent, which is generally the approach that he would take in the suttas. You know, if somebody is really disrespectful or something, he would just keep his mouth shut and just turn around and walk the other way or something. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Co Vaksh and Sipad Zidana. And I still don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but somebody in the kindness of his heart actually did send me links to Wikipedia articles, one on Siovak and the other one on Ensipad Zidana. So these were actually historical or mythological personages. Siovak was some Persian aristocrat in ancient times, and Ensipad Zidana was supposedly a king of Sumer who lived for tens of thousands of years. He's like a mythological, prehistoric king of Sumer, or one of those early places in Mesopotamia. Anyway, Siovech and Sipad Zidana says, in ancient times, before 100 AD, Buddhism was considered aniconic and would leave an empty space where the Buddha was supposed to be depicted in key events in early art. They used to use the feet of the Buddha, Dharma wheel, empty throne, horse with an empty flying chariot thing, forget the name, etc., to represent him. It only began with the Greek influence, first depicting the Buddha and claiming it is the Bodhisattva before he became enlightened. There are some debate on this issue, and some say that because there is only a ban on it explicitly in the Sarvastivada Vinaya and no others, that was just a tradition, that it isn't from the Buddha himself. Some even claim there was one depiction of Buddha before the Greek ones, but every time I see this claim, there is no citation. What are your thoughts on iconography in Buddhism? Do you think it has been an overall positive or negative? What do you think would be the Buddha's opinion on iconography, such as art depicting him or monasteries being full of statues that attempt to portray his physical likeness? Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I could address with regard to this. What Co Vaksha and Sipad Zidana says is true, that originally in the earliest Buddhist art, there would just be like an empty seat or a footprint or a Bodhi leaf or something, just to represent the Buddha indirectly, because the emphasis or the point they were trying to make is that the Buddha is no longer in this world. Like I mentioned earlier, he is no longer in any world. He's no longer in samsara. He has attained Nibbana. He is off the scale. And so originally in the oldest Buddhist art, he would not be portrayed. And then one of the main theories is that it started with the Greeks. And there was, around the same time, there were two places where the earliest Buddha statues arose. One is in the Greek kingdoms of northwestern India, which would now be mostly Pakistan and Afghanistan, I think. And the other one was in the city of Mathura, where it also could have started, but Mathura was within the Greek sphere of influence. Like King Menandros, who's called Milinda in Theravada Buddhism, actually invaded Mathura, and it was within his sphere of influence of his kingdom. So it could be that even if the earliest statues began in Mathura, it could still have been Greek influence. Claiming that these statues were of the Bodhisattva and not of the Buddha himself, thereby kind of justifying having an image of the man, reminds me that most Buddha statues in Burma I'm not sure about other Buddhist countries, but most Buddhist statues in Burma technically are of the Bodhisattva before he became enlightened, because it's in Pali it'd be called the Bhumi Pasa mudra. I guess mudra would be Sanskrit. It's the Bhumi Sparsha mudra, where the Buddha, I mean, I'm sitting down, you can't really see it. He's got one hand like this in his lap. He's sitting cross-legged, and the other hand is like this, touching the ground. And that was from the night of his enlightenment, before he became enlightened. So most of the Buddha statues you see in Burma, technically speaking, he wasn't the Buddha yet. And the whole Bhumi Sparsa mudra, I might be butchering the Sanskrit there, is, I mean, the reason why he's touching the ground with one hand is that according to the legend, when he sat down to meditate, he was firmly intent on becoming enlightened. And Mara, the evil one, you know, sort of the lord of samsara, came and was trying to get him to stop, because he didn't want anyone to escape from his empire, so to speak. And so he says, you know, you have no right to be sitting here, or some such. And the Buddha touched the ground to, I mean, calling upon the earth as his witness that he had the right to sit there. And that's the mudra, or the hand position. You know, the different hand positions of the Buddha have different meanings. Like, my personal favorite is Jhana Mudra, like the little white marble statue up there, where he's just sitting in meditation. And that's, that one indicates his actual enlightenment, where he is enlightened at that point. It's the Jhana Mudra, the meditation mudra. And the one over here, the sleepy Buddha, where he's kind of going like this, it's not orthodox. You don't see that one in Burma. That's, I don't know where that came from. Maybe Mahayana Buddhism or something. So anyway, let's see here. I'd never even heard that Buddha images are explicitly against the Sarvastivada Vinaya. Sarvastivada arose before the Greeks started making statues. I think Sarvastivada officially became a sect of Buddhism at around the Third Council, which would be during the reign of the Emperor Ashoka, which was before the Greeks came. It was after the Mauryan Empire was just collapsing that the Greeks came in and got some easy scores. So it could be just a late rule added to Sarvastivada, or it could be Mula Sarvastivada, which was like an attempted reform movement on Sarvastivada. It isn't from the Buddha himself. Well, I mean, it just wasn't a thing in the Buddha's time. I mean, they just didn't make statues like that. It was the Greeks were really into statues, so that's one of the bits of evidence that the Greeks actually started making Buddha statues after they invaded India and converted to Buddhism. Let's see. What are my thoughts on iconography in Buddhism? I really am indifferent. I'm the sort of person that rarely would I bow down to a Buddha statue. I think I have bowed down to that one before. I've never bowed down to an Orthodox one. For the most part, I wouldn't bow. Like, before a ceremony in Burma, all the other monks would be bowing to the statue, because in Burma they're very faith-oriented and devotionalistic, and they bow to the statue. And I'd just be sitting there kind of looking at them, or, you know, just looking at the statue. And sometimes, you know, they try and talk me into it. You know, oh, you get merit if you bow to the statue. And I just say merit is for lay people. Monks are supposed to go beyond that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't think the Buddha would encourage anyone to make statues of him any more than he'd encourage people to worship him. But then again, there are some suttas where he's doing exactly that. Not with regard to the statues, because the suttas were finished. The Pali suttas were done, and before anyone ever thought of making a Buddha statue, probably, or before anyone actually made one, before it went mainstream for sure. So, and the attempt to portray his physical likeness, I don't even know if they're seriously trying to portray the physical likeness of the Buddha, because in Burma, the Buddha looks kind of plump and effeminate looking, and kind of Burmese looking. Chinese Buddha statues look Chinese. Japanese Buddha statues look Japanese. The earliest Greek Buddha statues, he looked Greek. He looked European. And nobody really knows what he looks like, other than, you know, some fairly sketchy descriptions of what he looked like. He was tall, relatively thin, presumably. He had aristocratic features, probably more or less European, like Indo-European features, probably like a straight nose and high forehead and maybe thin lips, golden colored skin, supposedly. But people just make the statue so that the Buddha looks like the ethnicity of the culture in which the statue is made. And I don't know, for some people it can be helpful. For some people it may be a hindrance. I really don't think it's all that important, so long as you're not thinking that the statue is actually somehow the Buddha. I mean, definitely wouldn't spit on it. I mean, I might not bow to a statue, but I wouldn't just be like flagrantly disrespectful either. I mean, it's sort of a reminder of Gautama Buddha, or a reminder of this man who was just, fully enlightened, brilliant philosopher, just, a genius, a saint. So, I mean, he's worthy of respect regardless, even if you're not a Buddhist. So, I mean, to each his own. I don't really have a dog in the fight, to tell you the truth. So I'll just move on to C.O. Vaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question. And according to him, and I quote, this is going to be a long multi-part question, and all parts of it come from the relatively long Mula Pariyaya Sutta from the Majjhima Nikaya. This seems to be a relatively early text, as it has parallel recensions found in the Chinese Ekodarika Agama rather than in the Majjhima Agama. The sutta begins with the Buddha saying, "Mendicants, I will teach you the explanation of the root of all things." So, part one of his question here. The Buddha lists various things like the elements, the senses, gods, meditative states, unification, diversity, the all, and nibbana, and compares how a worldling, Sekha, Arahant, and Tathagata sees them. This seems to be closer to how the Abhidhamma emphasizes nibbana as just part of a list, rather than putting special emphasis on it like Mahayana do, although not exactly the same as either. What are your thoughts on this? Well, I haven't read the sutta in quite a long time. It's been years. I don't recall it vividly. But as a general rule, if I read a sutta in which they are like dividing up samsara or just the entire cosmos and classifying it, then I would not consider that sutta to be extremely early. The very fact that it's also in a Chinese recension, that it's also found in other early texts, it just means that it predates the first schism. And that was like 100 years after the time of the Buddha. And anyone familiar with the history of early Christianity can tell you that a heck of a lot of mutation and additions can arise in 100 years. So it could be relatively late, even though it was early enough to be before the first schism. Still, it's not necessarily what the Buddha was actually teaching. So let's see, what's the question here? What are your thoughts on this? Those are my thoughts, I guess. So I'll just move on to part two of this question. The Buddha doesn't call Nibbana an ultimate reality, but instead talks about the way we perceive the various things listed above, how we identify with them, cling to them, and all of it is a result of not knowing them properly. Most scholars take this to mean that the Buddha is saying that there is no true root of all things, but I can also see it as possibly saying ignorance is the root of all things. What's your opinion on this? Well, ignorance is the root of samsara, or ignorance or delusion, either one, take your pick. Kind of like a semi-conscious stupidity would be a good but long rendering of moha. Or avijja is just ignorance, but it's ignorance in the sense that you're not seeing the full picture. You're not seeing total reality. You're just seeing this limited little slice of reality and distorting even that and considering that to be the reality, and on and on. We needn't get into that too much, but let's see. The Buddha is saying that there is no true root of all things. This is the tricky part, and it's really hard to really hard to explain this. I've tried it many times, but when you get to the absolute, I mean, it transcends duality. The absolute transcends duality. So it transcends the duality of is and isn't, existence and non-existence. So, um, in a way, it's sort of like the Kantian thing in itself, or something like that. But even Kant would say that the thing of itself really exists, and like the root of all things. Yeah, it's like there are some suttas where the Buddha just says everything is without essence. There's no root. But then in other suttas, I mean, there is. I mean, and when you get to Abhidhamma, I mean, obviously they think everything that truly exists, all these little rupa kalapas, these little particles that compose the entire universe, particles of matter and mind, that they're all ultimately real, even though they last only a trillionth of a second. So let's see. What is my opinion on this? Most scholars take this to mean that the Buddha is saying, yeah, well, I mean, I'd have to read the sutta again, but just from what I've heard about this, I would be skeptical that it's really an archaic sutta that goes all the way back or even really close to the Buddha's time. That this one might have been right under the wire when towards the end of this 100 years of growth and expansion and like mutation of Buddhist doctrine, there was starting to be more and more diversity and classification schemes and so forth. And that's probably where Theravada became known as Vibhajavada, which is like the doctrine of like discrimination, just distinguishing this from that. And the early Theravadins were taking pride in that. But yeah, I really don't think that the Buddha was really, I think he was teaching pretty much the opposite of like discriminating this from that. Maybe at like a relatively elementary level for lay people, you have to discriminate right from wrong, that kind of a thing. But when you're getting up into the upper levels, distinguishing this from that, that's papancha. And that's like the root of delusion. And you're eventually going to have to leave that behind. I think the Buddha was a radical mystic. So I'll just move on to part 3 of this question. Okay, the term in Pali used is nibbana, but in the English they usually translate it here to extinguishment or unbinding. Yeah, that unbinding, that's Ajahn Thanissaro's pet rendering for it. This makes it seem to be in contrast to the all that the Buddha mentions before it, to make them seem like complete opposites. Before that, the Buddha talks about unity and diversity as opposite as well. What do you make of the Buddha using the words the all and nibbana as opposites? Well, the all would be like samsara. That would be the samsaric all, because nibbana really, I mean, it doesn't have an opposite really. But nibbana and samsara really aren't opposites. I mean, just sort of intuitively, you consider nibbana and samsara to be opposites, but really they aren't, because nibbana doesn't have an opposite, because it's just beyond dualism. You have to have dualism in order for there to be an opposite. So let's see. The term Pali used is nibbana. In English, they usually translate here as extinguishment or unbinding. Literally, regardless of what people like Ajahn Thanisaro try to tell you, literally, nibbana means blowing out. Like a fire, like a candle flame is blown out. And there's actually references to that in the Sutta Nipata, just as a flame, when it's blown out by the force of wind, goes to its cessation and no longer subjects itself to any designation. So too the Arahant, when he is blown out, he's comes to a cessation and no longer subjects himself to any designation. But Ajahn Thanisaro did point out that in ancient India, fire was considered to be a god, Agni, who has, I think he's like the second most popular god in the Rig Veda. Like the second highest number of hymns are dedicated to Agni, the god of fire, because he was the god of the sacrifice. And the Vedas are largely sacrificial hymns that were recited at fire sacrifices. Um, And the God, I mean, he exists regardless of whether there's a flame. There's like latent flame that's there even if there's no actual flame burning. And so Ajahn Tanisaro argues that Nibbana is kind of like that. I mean, you just kind of go back into this unformed, inchoate state after you become enlightened. But um, I mean, trying to understand Nibbana intellectually is a fool's errand, or maybe an intellectual fool's errand, because you really can't understand Nibbana by thinking about it. You can't understand ultimate reality by thinking about it, because it just transcends duality, and the thinking mind works in duality. So let's see. What do you make of the Buddha using the words the all and Nibbana as opposites? Um, well, I mean, there is another sutta where the all is defined as the eye consciousness, and the visual, the sense datum, and the ear and ear consciousness, and the auditory sense datum, and the nose and nose consciousness, and the olfactory sense datum, and it's all just a matter of um, just the six senses, because mind is considered to be the sixth sense, and the six senses and what is experienced through the six senses. So bovine glandular secretions. So it's just manner of speech, because truly Nibbana does not have an opposite, which kind of opened the door to the Mahayana Buddhists saying that ultimately Nibbana and samsara are the same. Like I've said a number of times, if you say that Nibbana is, just for the convenience, say that Nibbana is the essence of reality, then samsara is the form. The gold ring, it's the essence is gold, and ring, the thing with the hole in it, is the form. I mean, you have to have both. At least you have to have the essence. You can't have the gold ring without the gold. You can have gold without the ring, but you can't have the gold ring without the gold. I mean, there has to be a substance or an essence. And I would be more inclined to consider Nibbana. It's the uncarved block, and all these virtual statues that are created by mind through imagination of just kind of seeing it in the block or whatever. I mean, just for the sake of argument. I mean, I don't want to try and beat the dead horse here, but yeah. So let's see. I'll just move on to part 4 of Siovaksh and Sipa Zidana's complex question here. The ending of the sutta says, in a twist of events, that is what the Buddha said, but the mendicants were not happy with what the Buddha said. The commentaries explain that they were not happy because they were Brahmins, and this went against the idea of ultimate reality they had before being Buddhists, so it shook them. To me, it seems like this reaction wouldn't happen if the Buddha taught the exact same concept as Brahman as the Upanishadic sages. What are your thoughts on this? Again, I haven't read the sutta recently. I don't have like a clear recollection of it. Um, I it probably does not indicate that all of the monks were Brahmins. It could just be that it's just human nature. You want there to be a reality that you can understand and grasp, and he's just pulling the rug out from under them. And if you read something like the Attaka Wagga, which I talk about rather a lot, I mean, it really does. It just pulls the rug right out from under you. There's nothing that you can cling to, nothing that you can grasp, just nothing. I mean, you can't even grasp onto nothingness. You can't even cling to that. It's the empty set. It's not even zero. And I mean, most people, especially if they're just not ripe for full enlightenment, that's kind of scary and unsettling. And people want a certain security, including intellectual security. At least they want to know what's what. And when the Buddha is just like saying, there isn't any, just forget it. It's just no. Yeah, that's unsettling, and probably even though the monks maybe weren't Brahmins, they were probably unenlightened. They weren't fully enlightened yet, and so it just was kind of scary to them, or it just, again, it's just sort of pulling the rug out from under them. So Yeah, the Buddha wasn't teaching the exact same concept of Brahman in the Upanishadic sages, because the Upanishads reify the absolute, and in that's like the Buddha went like one step further, where he's not even trying to reify it. I mean, you can't explain it in words, and so he would just like not even try it. It's just off the scale. Your mouth is the name that can be named is not the eternal name. And so, I mean, for the most part, he would just sort of dance around it, maybe hint at it a little bit. It's not this, it's not that. Like the Upanishad says, neti neti, not this, not that. But yeah, I think I'll just move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question, because as I say, we've got quite a lot of them, which is generally the case lately. And I may have to start doing them once a week, as I keep saying. So, Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. The next question is, in the Simsapa Sutta, the Buddha picked up a handful of leaves and said that what he teaches is like the handful of leaves, and that what he knows from direct knowledge but doesn't teach is like the whole forest. He only teaches suffering, its cause, its cessation, and the path of its cessation, because that is what is useful for the holy life and reaching the goal. And I just want to say that Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana totally unnecessarily added apostrophes to its. I'm a grammar Nazi, I'm sorry. So, oh wait, he continues. Based on this, do you think the whole forest is what every arahant achieves upon enlightenment, or do arahants achieve the ultimate goal with just the handful of leaves amount of knowledge, like a sailor and having to travel all over the ocean to reach an island? If someone who has reached the destination already has made a map, and the Buddha's own vast knowledge came as a result of traveling all over the ocean before finding the island metaphorically. Well, um, this is kind of it's a good question, and sort of a subtle one, more subtle than it seems at first glance. Yeah, there is the sutta where the Buddha's in the simsapa grove. I can't remember what species of trees simsapa trees are. But yeah, he holds up a handful and says, what I teach you is like this, but I know like all the leaves in the forest amount of knowledge. And I mean, you can say just from the traditional point of view, from the Orthodox Theravadan point of view, the Buddha had, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of omniscience. What's sabanyuta is he knows all things if he wants to. I mean, he has to like attend to it in order to know it. And that would apply only to a fully enlightened Buddha, not to an ordinary arahant. And there are in the suttas mentions of dry visioned arahants who haven't acquired any psychic powers. They don't have any miraculous powers like that. They haven't become paranormal supermen. They just no longer have craving and attachment. And so I would be inclined to think that the original meaning of the sutta is that even an arahant might see more leaves. Somebody like Sariputta or Moggallana, they have a way bigger handful of leaves at the very least that they would know of. But yeah, I don't think that they would be considered omniscient. But then again, if you want to look at it in a different way, and this could be a relatively late sutta, but if you want to look at it in a different way, then, I mean, when you're enlightened, you're seeing ultimate reality. You know ultimate reality, which is the whole forest, whereas, um, the normie, the putujana, he's got ignorance, which prevents him from being enlightened, and that limits the amount of what he's able to see. So you could really interpret it both ways. And I'm not sure exactly what the original meaning was. I don't want to second guess the Buddha or whoever is the author of the sutta. But it could be interpreted both ways. But probably the orthodox explanation is that the Buddha was omniscient, and even a fully enlightened arahant who isn't a tathagata, that he wouldn't see as many leaves as the Buddha did. So I'll just move on to the next question. And this is from Dharma. And Dharma says, did your parents pass away while you were in Burma? Where were you able to attain their funeral, and did you wear your robe while doing so? Well, it turns out that both of my parents did die while I was in Burma. Um, in fact, when my father died, I didn't even hear about it. I was living in a cave out in the woods. Didn't hear about it until maybe 2 weeks later. And it was kind of a strange situation. I might as well digress in that I went for alms round in this village, Lamie village, and one of the people there had received a phone call from Rangoon, had received a message from Rangoon, I should say, telling me that my teacher, Venerable Pakoku Sayadaw, also known as Taungpulu Chaltsin Doya Sayadaw, he had passed away. So I asked this lady, could she make a phone call and find out when the funeral was going to be, because I wanted to attend Sayadaw's funeral. He was like my main teacher in Burma. So back in those days, in order to make a phone call, you had to get in a boat and cross the Chindwin River to a village on the other side of the river that actually had a phone. This was before cell phones and stuff made it to Burma. So later on that day, she came to visit me in my cave, and she said in just the softest voice, I have some bad news to tell you. Do you want to hear it? And right then I knew my father must have died. And that was the case. And I just had this empty feeling in my chest. I didn't cry, but I had just this emptiness in my chest. I made like this little, I had a picture of my dad, put it on the altar, offered little flowers to it, wished him well. And when my mother died, I was in Rangoon, and I just got an email. This was back when finally there was some semblance of internet in Burma, but it was really, really crappy, like 1G, something like that. And it was my brother who was distraught, telling me that my mother had died. And I mean, when you're a monk, you have no money. You can't just rush down into the travel agency and buy a ticket. I mean, you're dependent upon the generosity of lay people. And in Burma, there's not a whole lot of really wealthy lay people. I probably couldn't have made it back before the funeral anyway. So, yeah, the answer is yeah, my parents passed away while I was a monk in Burma, and I was not able to attend their funeral. Although I did attend my stepbrother's wedding as a monk, dressed in monk's robes, which probably the Christian minister, he didn't seem real thrilled about it, but there's not much you could say. So we'll just move on to Dharma's next question. Have you ever been interested in the Hare Krishna movement, also known as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness? I just learned that its founder, what is this, Srila Prabhupada, had some pretty negative views about blacks, Jews, and homosexuals. To tell you the truth, I've never really been interested in the Hare Krishnas. It's so faith-oriented. In fact, a Hare Krishna guy gave me a book once. It was, and it was warning against Hare Krishnas even associating with meditators. They're not supposed to have anything to do with meditators. A meditator's called something like a Mokshavadin, who thinks that you can actually become enlightened through self-cultivation rather than just reciting the names of God over and over and over again. So I've never been devotionalistic, really. I mean, I've had moments, but just by temperament, I'm just not a devotionalist. And so, no, I've never really been much interested in Hare Krishnas. But they had a really good vegetarian restaurant in Seattle. I remember I used to go there sometimes back when I was a vegetarian. And regardless, I mean, Prabhupada's negative views about blacks, Jews, and homosexuals, and that's irrelevant, I suppose. So we'll just move on to Dharma's next question. Have you ever been so sexually frustrated that you began to find another monk attractive? No, never have. I mean, I've met a few monks, they're like young monks that, because they're Asian, I suppose, partly because they're Asian, they'd have like feminine features, and you could think, wow, if he was a girl, he'd be really pretty. But still, I mean, I wasn't actually attracted to them. I have been so sexually frustrated when I was a monk that I'd find my own naked leg when I was taking a bath attractive. Look down, see my own naked leg. That could be stimulating somehow. but that's more autoerotic than homoerotic. So yeah, I've never been so sexually frustrated that I began to find another monk attractive. Although, I mean, if there's a guy who's a handsome guy, you can acknowledge he's handsome, but that's not the same as being sexually attracted to them. So, Dharma's next question. Is homoerotic behavior between monks forbidden, like hugging and sleeping in the same bed? Yes, it is forbidden. Um, it's a serious offense for a monk to touch a woman with lust. If he touches a woman and enjoys it and does anything to establish or prolong the contact, then he's got to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights. If he feels the same way while touching a eunuch, someone who's technically not fully male or female, a pandaka, then that is a tulachaya offense, which is a serious offense, but at least you can clear it through making confession. But if you touch a man and experience lust, then that's just a dukkha offense. It's still against the rules, but it's a minor offense, and you just make confession, and that kind of pushes reset or something. And so hugging a man in a kind of homoerotic behavior, it would be against the rules. It would be a dukkha offense. And if both, or if like one of them, the man that you're hugging is, let's say he's just really like, what's the word, like a flaming homosexual, he might qualify as a pandaka. So that could be a tulachaya offense, but still it's not as serious as touching a woman with lust. And sleeping in the same bed is against the rules. It's also a minor offense, but monks aren't allowed to sleep on the same bed or sleep on the same mat or sleep under the same blanket. That's against the rules. So there was some attempts to prevent that sort of thing in Theravada Buddhism. And I mean, it still happens, I'm sure, but it's not as rampant as the stuff you're hearing about, like in Roman Catholicism, the Roman Catholic clergy. So the next question from Dharma. Was the universe created according to Buddhism? And if yes, who created it? Well, I mean, the universe had no original creation. There wasn't one day when all of a sudden the universe came into existence. The universe has always been here. Samsara is beginningless and presumably endless. All beings are not going to become saved like the Mahayana Buddhists vow to do. I mean, the universe has already been here an infinitely long amount of time, and there's still countless numbers of suffering beings, apparently, at least, from the samsaric perspective. So I think the only way you can save all beings is to become enlightened and realize that all these individual beings that are supposedly suffering are just virtually or conditionally real and not ultimately real. But I mean, in a way, the universe is created, but it's created moment by moment through the power of karma and ignorance and delusion. So it's just this beginningless karma, and ignorance and delusion is just sort of generating samsara from moment to moment. So I'll just move on to Dharma's next question. What are your thoughts on monasteries in the West where bhikkhus and bhikkhunis live together? Isn't this almost impossible according to the suttas, since the Buddha said the following in the Digha Nikaya, quote, "How shall we relate to women, master? Do not look at them. But if one sees one, master, do not address her. But if one talks to us, keep mindfulness and self-control." And if I remember correctly, that was Ananda, the Buddha's attendant and cousin, asking the Buddha, what do we do about women? The Buddha says, don't look at them. And then Ananda says, but what if they're like standing in front of you? You can't help but see them. Just don't talk to them. And it's, what if they talk to us first? I mean, what we have to engage somehow. And it says, just be very careful, be very mindful. And there is a sutta, I don't remember which one, it might be in the Anguttara Nikaya or something, that says one of the signs of the decay of Buddhism, the decline of Dharma in the world, is there will be monasteries where monks and nuns are living together. Not necessarily sleeping together, all they have to do is just be living in the same monastery, and that is a sign that Buddhism is on the downhill slide. So let's see, what are my thoughts on monasteries in the West? Um, yeah, it's probably best not to do it. Every once in a while, even in Burma, because there are places like that in Burma too, like Mahasi centers, they'll have, I mean, they're not bhikkhunis because in Burma there are no bhikkhunis. Just in traditional Theravada Buddhist countries, at least in Thailand and Burma, I'm not sure about Sri Lanka, but I mean, the ecclesiastical system just does not acknowledge the validity of ordained nuns anymore. So you've got nuns, but they follow like 8 or 10 precepts. They don't follow the full Vinaya rules. They wear, I think in Thailand they wear white. In Burma they usually wear sort of a pink color or like a peach color with some brown. Um, but those kind of nuns will live at the same monastery or meditation center as fully ordained monks. And every once in a while, you'll have some scandal of some nun and some monk just run off together. And that's happened in the West also, I have heard. So yeah, it's not a good idea. Maybe it's seen as just sort of necessity in the West because there's limited resources for supporting monasteries and so forth. But it is a sign of decline according to the Pali texts. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Satya. And Satya says, I find the commentaries to be of great value. What do you think of them? Well, I consider, like the Burmese, consider the commentaries to be even more important than the Pali texts because, I mean, if in the sutta itself the Buddha says blue, but in the commentary it says when the Buddha said blue, what he really meant was red. If you don't have the commentary, you're not going to know that when it says blue in the text, it really means red. And there is a lot of that. Like there is the scene in Vinaya. There's a narrative where the Buddha says that because of the ordination of nuns, the Buddha Sasana will survive for only 500 years. And then in the commentary, it says, well, when he said 500 years, what he meant was 5,000 years. And why he would say 5,000 if he meant 500, I mean, that's just silly. But by the time the commentaries were composed in medieval Sri Lanka, approximately 1,000 years later, at least the versions that we have today, reach pretty much their final form, over 1,000 years later, after the time of the Buddha. I mean, obviously the 500 years had already elapsed, and they can't say, well, the Buddha was wrong, or this just is just spurious. It was added later. It's not genuine teachings of the Buddha. They couldn't adopt either of those recourses like a modern Westerner can do. So they just say, well, when he said 500, he meant 5,000, and just kind of that's the best they could do to kind of patch up the situation. But the commentaries, you're better off not relying on them. I mean, if you can use your own intuition, you just read the text, let it flow through your mind, and just a lot of the time it'll just click. It's like intuitively you'll be able to make sense of at least most of it. And some of it you may not understand, and there's a good chance the commentators also wouldn't understand. They make a lot of wild guesses, and the trouble is they don't admit that they're making wild guesses. They say, this is what it means, even though they're guessing, and sometimes they guess wrong. So I really don't have much use for Buddhagosism as opposed to Buddhism. Buddhaghosa, of course, being the main editor and compiler of most of, or a lot of the Tathagatas or Theravada Buddhist commentaries. And he is the author of the Visuddhimagga, which is sort of like the central hub of all of the commentaries. It's like the main commentarial text in Theravada Buddhism. So sometimes, though, there's like a certain Pali word that occurs only once or twice in the entire Tipitaka. Like in Vinaya, it'll have this word that you don't know what it means. You've never seen that word before. So you can look in the commentary to kind of get an idea. It's like they'll say this, but I mean, it's just an idea. It's just a suggestion because there's a good chance they don't know either. But they can't admit that they don't know. So they'll just come up with something. They'll make their best guess, which maybe isn't a very good guess. So I wouldn't rely on the commentaries any more than you have to. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from David. What do you make of Dr. Ian Stevenson's work? I remember reading Hone Kennett's work, which alluded to her lameness being accountable from her previous karma as a tiger. I don't find it fantastical at all. I'm fairly sure rebirth is real from experience and a logical point of view. Many thanks. Well, I have read 2 books by Dr. Ian Stevenson, and um, he was a psychologist, I think, at, I think it was the University of Virginia. And he was trying to find scientific evidence to support the idea of rebirth or reincarnation. And um, most of what he was doing, especially in his earlier several books, was locating young children, like small children, who remembered previous lives. And sometimes they could come up with information about, where they lived, who their family members were, who their friends were, how they died, and then that could be verified. And sometimes, like in the ideal case for Dr. Stevenson, he'd find the child before there had been any contact between, this child and this other family that the child supposedly died out of. And it's really interesting, a lot of it. I mean, you can call it circumstantial evidence, and maybe there's some frauds involved, but some of it's, yeah, it's definitely considerable evidence. And then I guess later on, I didn't read any books on the subject by him, but he was starting to specialize in people born with strange birthmarks that somehow they were related to something that happened to him in previous existence. And that, I think I might have a strange kind of mark on my body that's derived from a previous existence. I've got like this purple spot, um, like over a certain lymph node on my body. And I think there's a good chance that that's where the bubo was that killed me when I died of bubonic plague in the 14th century. A lot of people did die of bubonic plague in the 14th century, like 1/3 of the Earth's population. But I mean, it's just all, you can't really prove it one way or the other. It's just very interesting, and you're probably better off not spending too much time and energy, trying to figure it out or get proof or anything, because I don't think you're ever going to really be able to prove it one way or the other. But yeah, Dr. Ian Stevenson's work is well worth reading, especially if you're open-minded yet still somewhat skeptical of the idea of rebirth. He does present some more or less scientific evidence for rebirth. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from KC. And KC asks, can I ask why you left the Washington area? Well, I grew up in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And the first time I left it was to become a monk. I was living in Bellingham near the Canadian border before I became a monk. And so the first time I left was to become a monk. And then I came back and tried to live in Bellingham again in 2011 and made some efforts over the next couple years. And it just it just didn't work out. It turns out that later on, I met this old Burmese lady who actually bought a house for a friend of mine, a monk friend of mine, near Seattle, and was, she was supporting him living there. And if that had happened to me, it might have really struck traction or something. But it didn't happen to me. It happened to him instead. And yeah, it was just, I just wasn't getting enough support. I mean, I had some generous supporters that were happy to support me, enthusiastic about it, but I didn't want to be a burden on them. I mean, it was just, in single digits, the number of people who were willing to bring me food every day and that sort of thing, offer me shelter and that sort of thing. And so I was living from hand to mouth, which is good for a monk to live from hand to mouth. A monk is supposed to live from hand to mouth, but still in America, it just wasn't working out very well. So eventually I just went back to Burma and started like commuting back and forth between Burma and California, where there's a large Burmese community willing to support monks ordained in a Burmese tradition, which was not the case in northwestern Washington state. So it was largely just a matter of support at the time. And KC also asked a question. There were a number of questions that, I mean, they haven't really made the cut of this list because they were like rhetorical questions or something. He asked, what is BitChute, which is, it's like an alternative to YouTube with less censorship and attempted thought control on the part of the people who manage it. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Johannes, and Johannes has asked a number of questions here. And his first question is, do you have some experience with the Sri Lankan Theravada? I seriously think about ordaining in the coming years, probably in 2 years when my current project of building a meditation center is finished. I thought Sri Lanka might be good since they speak English there and they had some quite appealing masters in the last century, Ayakema Nyanaponika, in parentheses. Do you think it's an authentic Theravada that is practiced there, especially in regards to rules and knowledge of the Pali scriptures? I also wish to become a wandering ascetic at one point, what in Thailand is called tudong. Do you maybe know if this is a common practice in Sri Lanka? Okay, well, for the most part, the mainstream of Theravada Buddhist monasticism in Sri Lanka is just corrupt as hell. I mean, there's very little monastic discipline there anymore. It's very corrupt as a general rule, just with regard to the mainstream. You know, it's very few Sri Lankan monks even make token effort to really follow the rules strictly. They're very nice and they speak English even in their monasteries in the West, unlike most Thai and Burmese, probably other Asian ethnicities. Like, well, they speak English there, unlike, like, you go to a Burmese temple or a Thai temple, they'll be speaking mostly Burmese or Thai inside the temple, whereas in Sri Lanka they're mostly just speaking English, partly because at least the Sri Lankan temples I visited in America, they the supporters are Sri Lankan professionals like engineers and computer programmers and so forth, that they're just really intelligent. They speak good English. I guess in Sri Lanka there's just a culture, just probably going back to British colonialism, where educated people speak good English. But there is like a reform movement, like a forest tradition in Sri Lanka that is serious. So if you wanted to ordain there and be a serious monk, you'd have to find like some monastery or some senior monk, some Thera, who's in this forest tradition that is actually trying to walk the talk. Like Sri Lankan monks, a lot of them, it might even be the majority of Sri Lankan monks, don't even consider it to be possible to become enlightened anymore. That it's just, we're like in the Kali Yuga or something. It's a degenerate age. People just can't become enlightened. So they just consider it to be their duty to memorize the text or to understand the text and teach the text, preserve the Pali texts in case things get better in the future. At least they're helping people to get some Dhamma, you know, in this life, even though according to them you can't become enlightened anymore. But I'm pretty sure that there are monks striving for enlightenment out in the forests in this sort of, it's a relatively recent movement in Sri Lanka, or so I have read and heard. But it might be that you would prefer Thailand, where there is the tudong tradition. I'm not sure. I assume there is some like dhutanga in Sri Lanka among these serious forest ascetics, but I really don't know a heck of a lot about it. But I'm sure you could find out some good information on the subject before you go to Sri Lanka to be ordained. I mean, you should find out who's good, where are the good places, or at least one good place before you go there. Unless you've got a lot of money and time to just tour the country and look for some place and some teacher that resonates with you. That could work too. So I'll just move on to the next question from Johannes. I assume it's pronounced Johannes. Did you have a favorite dhutanga? One where you had the impression it helped you greatly on your path? Eating one meal a day was helpful. I like that. I ate one meal a day for almost every single day for 30 years. Sometimes there'd be a few exceptions, like you're on a plane crossing the Pacific Ocean and you're just sitting there and for hours and hours, and anything that they'd give me in the morning, I'd eat. Although technically it didn't break the dhutanga so long as I didn't get up in between, because it's just one sitting. It's not one meal, it's one sitting. Um, Another dhutanga that was helpful was the alms round dhutanga. And there were, for a long time, I seriously followed. Now, I would only eat food that I had collected in the village in my bowl. Of course, it's not going to work so well in America. I think there are a few monks that at least go for alms round in the West and actually collect food that way. I've been told that one way that they do this is stand in front of a grocery store and explain to people they don't accept money, but they'll accept food that gets put in there into their bowl. So yeah, eating only alms food. I mean, sometimes you might have to fast for a few days if you're traveling and it's just not working out. But yeah, that was a good one too, and it does keep you from getting spoiled. Like once you have your own monastery, people are going to be wanting to bring you food, and you can just sort of hold them at bay by saying, "I only eat alms food." So I'll just move on to the next question. This is also from Johannes. When practicing dhutanga of not lying down, are we allowed to lean against something like the back of a couch, and are we allowed to sleep? Well, of course you're allowed to sleep. I mean, you go without sleep long enough and you're going to crack up. A friend of mine actually did this because of the sitting dhutanga. Um, if you read the Visuddhimagga, I'm pretty sure it's the second chapter of the Visuddhimagga. It's all about dhutanga. It's just a list and explanation of the 13 dhutangas, which are optional ascetic practices. And each dhutanga has 3 levels. It's like hard, medium, and easy. And the dog just came in. How you doing? So, with regard to the sitting dhutanga, the sitter's practice, easy is you're allowed to sit in a chair. And the tradition in which I was ordained, the Tongpulu tradition, all the monks were supposed to do the sitter's practice. They did not lie down when they slept. So the easy, and most of them followed the easy level, which was you can use a chair. So they had kind of like a wicker, kind of almost a reclining chair. And I would consider anything more than a 45 degrees, you get beyond 45 and you're lying down. So long as you're more vertical than horizontal, so like at least like that, I think technically you could still be doing the sitter's practice, at least at the easy level. When I was a young monk doing the sitter's practice, I followed the intermediate, the medium level, which is you're allowed to lean back against a board. Or another alternative is you can take like a rope or a belt or something and you sit with your knees up and you just kind of wrap it around your back and your shins, and that kind of holds you up with your knees up. But it seems like that would be really rough on your behind after a while. It's just, you got all of your weight just on this small amount of flesh. I don't think it would be comfortable. You'd probably be better off leaning back against a board or something. Just leaning back against the wall is too vertical. I mean, you have to lean back at least a little bit. And the hard level, you can't lean against anything. You can't lean back against anything. So you got to be just sitting there as though in meditation. I guess Webu Sayadaw of Burma, who was considered to be an arahant, would sleep that way. And I had this friend who was trying to do all of the dhutangas at the hardest level. He was just like this Buddhist Rambo. He wasn't really following the middle path. Most people stray towards the self-indulgence side, instead of the middle path. They kind of veered towards, excessive comfort and so forth. He veered the other way. He veered towards self-torture. And, but even so, I mean, he just could not sleep just sitting upright. So he put his alms bowl in front of him and leaned forwards and just kind of rest his forehead on his alms bowl. And he eventually cracked up, largely through lack of sleep. Just sleep deprivation caused him to crack up. And he had to be sent home to America. He was in Asia at the time. He was sent home to America. It was like the ambassador or one of the consuls or something had to like help him get on the plane because he was pretty much out of it for a while. And as soon as he got better, he just came right back to Burma, I think, and reordained. I think he reordained in Burma under Taungpulu Sayadaw. So those are the three levels. I mean, all of the dhutangas have three levels, like easy, medium, and hard. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. What would you as a monk do on uposatha? Is it important for lay people? And do you think the moon has an impact on our meditation and mindfulness and our energy level? Well, uposatha, for those of you who aren't familiar, um, it's it's sort of like the Buddhist Sabbath. It's sort of like the Buddhist equivalent of Sunday or Saturday, if you're that sort of Christian. Um, but it's the full moon, the new moon, and the half moon days. So there's four per lunar month. And what would I, as a monk, do on uposatha? Well, according to the Buddhist monastic code, on the full moon days and the new moon days, all the monks have to meet together in the congregation hall, or whatever they have that's a rough equivalent to a congregation hall, inside the same ecclesiastical boundary, and do an uposatha ceremony. And if you're just by yourself living out in the woods, the uposatha ceremony means you uncover your shoulder, you squat down, and you say ajame uposatho 3 times, which just means today is my uposatha. And if you don't do that, that's against the rules. You've committed a dukkha offense, which is a minor offense. You can expiate it through confession. If there's 2 or 3 monks, pretty sure it's 2 or 3, yeah, 2 or 3 monks, then there's this short little ceremony. It's longer than ajame uposatho, but it takes just a few minutes. But if there's 4 or more monks, that's a sangha. It takes at least 4 monks to make a sangha. And then you have to recite the Patimokkha. And that was my duty at some of the monasteries I lived at. At some of the monasteries, I was the only monk who had memorized by heart the entire Bhikkhu Patimokkha. And so my mouth doesn't move very fast. Some Burmese monks, they just rattle through it. It's just boom. It's like an auctioneer reciting the Patimokkha rules, and they can be done in like 20 minutes. But for me, it would take, if I was doing it really fast, for me, it would take at least 35 minutes to get through the ceremony. And you have to squat. You know, everyone's like in this squatting position, you know, making anjali with their hands. And during hot weather in Burma, I mean, I'd have like these 2 puddles of sweat, like one underneath each elbow while squatting like this by the time we were done. And sometimes your legs can just be in agony if you have to squat for a long time. That's one of the self-tortures the Jains used to do, is just squat for a long time. But on the 8-day, the half moon days, we didn't have to do anything in particular. I stayed at one big school monastery where the novices all had to go on the half moon days and the full and new moon days and retake their precepts, but the monks didn't have to do that. And with regard to the second part of this question, do I think the moon has an impact on our meditation and mindfulness and our energy level? Maybe a really subtle one, but I haven't really noticed it consciously. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. Why can sati be translated as mindfulness and memory? It seems like these are 2 different states of mind or phenomena. I would say mindfulness is directing your mind to a certain phenomena, while memories come in at random, almost like a sense contact. Thank you for your answers. Yeah, I used to think about this too. Why is it that being in the present moment has the same word as remembering something in the past that you're not supposed to do when you're being mindful? Or at least, I mean, you can remember the past when you're being mindful, so long as you are like in the present moment, observing yourself, remembering something in the past, which is a little bit tricky. So it did seem strange to me. How did they come up with the same word? Sati literally means like memory. How did memory come to mean not thinking of the past at all, but just being in the present moment? And I was kind of surprised when I read in St. John of the Cross's works that for a Catholic contemplative, the word for mindfulness that they use for their own, just being in the present moment, not thinking anything more than you need to think, just being right here, right now, be here now. That's called recollection, which also means memory. How it came to be that both Catholic contemplative monastic orders and Theravada Buddhism, or just Buddhism in general, came to use the same word for memory as mindfulness. So I really don't know the answer to that. But I guess you could say that both what they have in common is just presence of mind. But I mean, a lot of the time memory is, it's a conscious effort. You're trying to remember a name or something, then, you're deliberately trying to remember it. But it is a good question, and I really don't have the answer of why it's the same, not only in Buddhism, but in like Roman Catholicism also. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. Just checking the time here. Okay, so Johannes's next question is, can the word kaya be equaled with our contacts? On an experiential level, how do we know that we have a body? We only experience it as a sense contact. So can kaya sati be equated with the mindfulness of the feelings of the body? I'm also wondering, what is the actual difference between samadhi and samasati? So I guess this is another question. Samadhi is defined as knowing feeling as feeling, contact as contact, etc. But wouldn't this be equated with what most people say is right mindfulness? If I remember correctly, right mindfulness includes mindfulness of the anicca, or impermanence, aspect of these phenomena. Is that maybe the difference? Okay, well, the first part about the meaning of kaya. Kaya literally means body, or you can use it as mass, but usually it does mean body. And how do we know at the experiential level that we have a body? It's indirectly. We have to infer the existence of physical matter, because all we can really know directly is mind or mental states. So in Theravada Buddhism, they just assume that physical matter is ultimately real. And in Abhidhamma especially, physical matter is one of the four ultimate realities, along with mind, mental states, and nibbana. So, yeah, we do only experience it indirectly. There really is no proof that physical matter even exists, which I think Immanuel Kant called the great scandal of philosophy, which is also, it kind of, it's a good argument against some scientists, or scientific atheists especially, who insist that matter is the one thing that we can know, and really it's our own mental states. It's like subjectivity is the only thing we really know. And different philosophers and different people have dealt with that issue differently. So let's see. So can kaya sati, or mindfulness of the body, be equated with the mindfulness of the feelings of the body? Yeah, that's something that I've been going with for a long time. Like if you're doing anapana, you're not really being mindful of the air and going in and out of your nose. You're being mindful, if you're doing it well, of just the sensation of touch. So yeah, I never had any use for mindfulness of the body, even though it's one of the four satipatthanas, because you can't really know the body except through mind. So it's still a kind of mindfulness of like citta nupassana or vedana nupassana, which is mindfulness of your own mind, or mindfulness of feelings. Yeah, so I agree with that. It's, I don't know if you could call it sloppy thinking or what, but yeah, it does seem to be kind of a potential glitch in the system. So then I'll just move on to the second part here, the second half of this question. I'm also wondering, what is the actual difference between samadhi and samasati? Samadhi is defined as knowing feeling is feeling, contact is contact, etc. But there might be a sutta or two that explain it that way, which would be like advanced practice. But samadhi, or right view, is step one on the Eightfold Path. And so for most people, especially lay people, people that really are not experienced meditators or like renunciants, right view is like, there is karma, that there is morality and immorality, right and wrong, that you have certain moral duties like supporting your parents and that sort of thing. That would be right view. Um, just like understanding or at least believing the Four Noble Truths. That is, it would be considered right view at the elementary level. So it's sort of like the roadmap, just sort of knowing the roadmap to practice. It's like step one. And this in the seen there is only the seen, in the heard there is only the heard kind of a stuff. That's very advanced practice, and that would be more properly known as mindfulness, or even concentration if you get really advanced in it. So yeah, so that would be the difference. There might be a sutta that is saying right view is this advanced level, being in the present moment, not interpreting, having a running commentary and that sort of thing. But for most people, right view, it just has, the basics of Buddhist philosophy, including the Four Noble Truths and so forth. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. And he says, one of the wrong livelihoods is abstaining from trading with meat. Wouldn't this also include sustaining your life force by buying meat? I think technically it's wrong livelihood is trading in animals for slaughter. Once it's already dead, I don't think it's necessarily wrong livelihood, although most butchers are also the guys who sell meat. I mean, traditionally, it's just modern times that you have supermarkets where the guy selling you the meat isn't the guy that killed the pig the day before. So technically, I don't think that just selling meat is wrong livelihood. If it's been killed by somebody else, you're not like paying the person to kill the animal. It's just being shipped to you in a truck or something. Then it'd be more wrong livelihood to sell mouse traps or cans of insecticide or beer, because then you're selling intoxicants, or you're selling, like poisons and that sort of thing. And wrong livelihood, yeah, it wouldn't be wrong livelihood to buy meat, because buying something isn't a livelihood unless you're a professional buyer for somebody. So that would be something entirely different. And mainly, I mean, there's so many people in the West, including Western Buddhists, that are just locked into this Western utilitarian ethic, where they don't realize that Buddhist ethics are subjective. It's a matter of your own mental states. And so they're saying, oh, it's immoral to buy meat, because then it's like voting in favor of killing and so forth. But they're taking it, I mean, they're taking it outside of themselves. Something out there is making it immoral, but really it's your own mental states. So technically, if eating meat or buying meat is making bad karma for you, it's because of your own like guilt and these feelings of, I'm doing something wrong, this is bad, I shouldn't be doing this, but I'm doing it anyway. So, I mean, just buying meat or eating meat, ultimately it's morally neutral, especially if you didn't kill the animal yourself, you didn't have somebody else kill it for you. It wasn't killed for your sake. Like monks are allowed to eat meat. Theravada Buddhist monks, the ancient Indian scriptures, the Buddha himself ate meat if you read the Pali texts. And I mean, a monk isn't allowed to ask for like fancy, like good food, which includes meat, unless he's sick, or unless someone has already given him permission in advance that he can ask for it if he wants it. So yeah, the whole issue of eating meat. I mean, there's other things too, paying taxes, or voting for corrupt politicians or something. I mean, it depends on your own mental state, whether it's moral or immoral. And two people can do exactly the same action, and it's moral for one person and immoral for the other. One example that I've given probably a few times, at least in these Q&As. You're walking through the forest, you hear a frog squealing. You walk over and see what it is. There's a snake trying to eat this frog. So you take a stick or something and you chase the snake away. You save the frog. So is that moral or immoral? Well, if you do it out of compassion for the frog, you've made good karma. If you do it out of aversion for the snake, then it's bad karma. If you do it for a mixture of both, then it's a mixture of good and bad karma, or wholesome and unwholesome, skillful or unskillful karma. So, I mean, you can do the exact same action of chasing the snake away from the frog, or chasing the cat away from the bird or whatever. And it depends on what your motive is that determines whether it's skillful or unskillful, whether you're making good karma or bad karma. And that is similar to eating meat. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. How do you explain discriminating Vinaya rules? It seems like not allowing hermaphrodites to ordain as a monk doesn't really make sense in regard to practice. Why should someone not be able to develop their mind and heart only because of bodily features? Well, obviously, you can't ordain a woman as a monk because a woman would be a nun. And in order to be a monk, you have to be male. In fact, you have to be an intact male. A castrated male cannot be a monk. So, partly, I mean, if you read the Vinaya text, it explains why they did not allow pandakas, which were mostly eunuchs. Hermaphrodites are very rare, and there might be somewhat different reasons, but a eunuch in ancient India, one of the main reasons why they were made eunuchs is for sexual purpose. They were like, a man have sex with a eunuch was like an alternative to a woman, sort of like the ancient Romans having sex with boys. It's sort of like it was like an alternative to having sex with a woman, just kind of a little bit of variety or something. With regard to hermaphrodites, I mean, it could be a slightly different reason than that. Because, I mean, the eunuchs, getting back to the eunuchs though, I mean, they were largely castrated for sexual purposes. They were used as prostitutes and so forth. And they had a reputation for being sexually promiscuous, like flagrantly gay men. It's a stereotype. Not all gay men or homosexual men are sexually promiscuous. We're just like licentious, unrestrained in their sexual impulses. But I mean, you read medical guides, you read medical manuals, and it's not uncommon for a homosexual man to have had sex with more than 100 or 1,000 other men. I read that in a medical guide. I've read it elsewhere too. It's not all that uncommon for a gay man to have had more than 1,000 sexual partners. So, I mean, one of the reasons why they're trying to weed out that sort of thing, just prevent them from being ordained, is just to avoid the likelihood of scandals and so forth. But with regard to hermaphrodites, I mean, they would be scary. I mean, ancient India, pre-modern cultures, they're superstitious, and like people that are way out of the ordinary, it makes people feel uneasy, to say the least, or they could be like completely frightened. And so there are rules against people with leprosy being ordained, albinos, people that are just have any kind of really strange physical abnormality are not allowed to be ordained as monks, or at least they're not supposed to be, just because there's the reputation of the Sangha. They didn't want the Sangha to get, to scare people, to have like get a bad reputation for these, freaks or whatever that are being ordained. So it could be that too. I mean, a hermaphrodite, I mean, they can be kind of, especially to a simple villager in a pre-modern culture, it's like, nah. So, I mean, apparently Johannes here is using modern or postmodern liberal ethics, diversity and inclusion and all that, as and just sort of transplanting it back into ancient India and applying modern or postmodern ethical standards to ancient India. And yeah, I don't think it really works that way. So I'll just move on to Johannes's next question. Reading the suttas, I often stumble upon the instructions imagining light, but there's not really any elaboration in the text as far as I know. Is this maybe regarding nimittas or light kasina? Also, I remember a text that anupanasati bhavana is apparently part of the wind kasina practice. This and another text in the suttas where I read that one should imagine the kasina completely around oneself makes it seem quite different from the Visuddhimagga style kasina practice. Do you think it's possible that kasina got misinterpreted over the centuries and was practiced way differently in the times of the Buddha? I don't really understand why kasina should be useful for developing right mindfulness, and if it's just about focusing on something, then why use these objects for it and not, for example, a tree or my hand? Well, I think like the Visuddhimagga gives detailed explanations or like instructions for kasina meditation, and I think for the sake of just standardizing and classifying everything, they've just got 10 kasinas, and um, it I mean, it wasn't necessarily that way in the Buddhist time. And a kasina, for the most part, is just a disc, and you just meditate on this disc. It's essentially like a hypnotic disc. And I'm going to get up and close the door in a second. Okay. So, yeah, I think kasina was more loosely interpreted in early times. It's just meditating on something more or less disc shaped. Even light kasina, like one way of doing a light kasina is um, there's like well, I mean that would be fire kasina, I guess. One way of doing light kasina is a monk would actually cut a circular hole in the wall of his hut, and the light shining through that would be like a bright light. I mean, now you could use just a circular light, I guess. And it is interesting that at Stanford University in California, they've got a hypnosis lab there. And the standard method, they're trying to be scientific, of course, so they're using the standardized hypnotic method. They try to use the same method to hypnotize many different subjects, and it's looking at a small circle. And that's their hypnotic subject. So it may be that by the time the Visuddhimagga was composed, there was a certain amount of confusion between deep meditative states and just self-hypnosis. And imagining the kasina completely around yourself, there's some of that reminiscent in the Visuddhimagga, where after you've been meditating on this circle, this disc of some color or fire, one of the four elements, earth, water, wind, fire, whatever. I mean, how you have a circle of wind, I don't know. But once you've mastered it well enough that even with your eyes closed, you still see it. You're sort of getting into a hypnotic state, I guess. Then you start manipulating it, making it bigger and smaller and that sort of thing. And I guess if you make it big enough, you can just be like filling, the area, including you. But yeah, it's probably in the Buddhist time, assuming that he did teach kasina of some sort. It was probably more vague, more wide open. You're like focusing on some sort of object, like external, visual object or something. So there's a story where um, Sariputta, who was the Buddha's chief disciple, his right hand man, had a disciple, and the disciple just wasn't responding. Sariputta was, giving him different meditation objects and so forth, and the student just wasn't doing very well. So he went to the Buddha, and the Buddha just gave him a red flower and just said, meditate on this. And because the Buddha could see into a person and know where they were stuck and know how best to help them, that it was just for some reason due to his temperament or his character or whatever reason, meditating on this red flower just worked, and he became enlightened eventually. So that might qualify as a kasina back in the Buddhist time before it got standardized into these discs and just 10, a variety of 10. But yeah, it's a matter of debate, I suppose. It's hard to say exactly what was actually the case in the Buddhist time, and I've spent years and years doing my best to understand, you know, what Dhamma was like in the Buddhist time, but to some degree, you just can't know for sure. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Hereward the Wake. Hereward the Wake. I have a question which relates to your interview with Otto Excelsior on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. When you talked briefly of Kant during that interview, you mentioned that Kant thought that one could not know anything beyond the contents of one's own mind. This sounds very much like solipsism, but is it redeemed through the Kantian moral imperative, i.e. Kant's ethics? Not necessarily. As far as I understand it, The only thing that saved Kant from solipsism was his belief that there really is a thing in itself out there, even though we can't know it. But his successors, I mean, he was like the founder of German idealism, and his successors kind of realized, like Hegel, for example, realized that, I mean, if you can't really know the thing in itself, why even insist that it exists? Why assert its existence? And so they just did away with it and they became idealists. It's all just a manifestation of mind. And I mean, it's not just the German idealists. Some schools of Buddhism, like Yogacara, which is one of the main branches of Mahayana, they're essentially solipsists. They're saying that everything you experience is just a creation of your own mind through the power of your own karma. So, yeah, I think Kant just, he knew that you could not prove the existence of physical matter, but nevertheless, he did believe that there was something out there that was real, the thing in itself that was causing us to see, the thing as it seems. But his successors, or many of his successors in German philosophy, including Schopenhauer too, just realized that the whole ultimate reality of the thing in itself out there somewhere was just superfluous because I mean it was just unnecessary, at least philosophically or logically. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo, do you think that translating Dharma texts for a modest living can be considered right livelihood? Yeah, sure. I mean, as long as you're not ripping anybody off or anything, then yeah, that can be right livelihood. You're not, I mean, you're not causing harm to anybody. You're actually helping people. So yeah, that was an easy question. So long as you just be careful that you're translating well. You don't want to mess up the Dharma by making bad translations. And I won't name any names, but there are some bad translators out there. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Edelweiss Voyager. Edelweiss Voyager? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to pronounce these names. Anyway, Edelweiss says, are you familiar with the book Radical Dharma? It is written by a black lesbian and black queer man that claims the title of Lama. Lama. It preaches liberation theology and interprets dependent co-arising as the same thing as communist intersexuality. It would be nice to see a video responding to this if you have not already. Yeah, I've never heard of it, but it doesn't surprise me. I mean, there's just a strong thread or current of this kind of thing in Western Buddhism, especially associated with academia and just sort of California in general, I think. Yeah, to interpret dependent co-arising as the same thing as communist intersexuality, third wave feminism or something. I mean, that's just bullshit. I mean, it's just insanity. But they don't care because truth is just a cultural construct and you can just create your own truth. And then once you gain power, socially, politically, then you just impose your truth on others. Because if they don't accept your truth, then they're fascists or Nazis or hate speech mongers or something. But yeah, there's lots of this. I mean, I get exposed to it quite a lot. And if I were to do some kind of video on something like this, I'd probably do something that's not an entire book that I have to read. I wouldn't want to read an entire book of this stuff. You can just find like academic articles on the same kind of stuff. But yeah, liberation theology, yeah, I've come across that term in like just really far leftist, um, just postmodern attempts to just redefine Buddhism because, of course, it's all a social construct anyway. So I think I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Mahabodhi Templar, who goes by a multitude of names. This is his most recent, I think. And Mahabodhi Templar says, are bhikkhus allowed to hold government office? Does it make a difference if the position is elected like a president or dog catcher or hereditary like a king or mucky muck? I think bhikkhus are allowed to hold a government office of like advisor to the king. I'm sure there have been bhikkhus who were advisors who weren't getting paid because, I mean, it's against the rules of monastic discipline for a monk to accept money or even any kind of payment for services rendered. He's not even allowed to barter really unless um, the terms are dictated by somebody else. I mean, there's these loopholes that a monk can do, but yeah, I think that would be about the extent. I mean, maybe like in Sri Lanka, you've got monks that are university professors and probably like a government-run university. It'd be government funded anyway. Um, and so long as they're not getting paid for it, which most of them are, I'm pretty sure. Um, I mean, I don't think there'd be necessarily anything wrong with that. Or at least there wouldn't be anything against the rules. Although, of course, a bhikkhu should be sitting at the root of a tree meditating. He should be striving for enlightenment. That's the job of a monk, is to cultivate wisdom and try to become enlightened in this very life, if possible. So getting involved in government service and so forth is probably not optimum for a monk. But so long as he's doing something dharmic, like an advisor, and not getting paid for it, then I don't think it would be against the rules. And I don't think it really matters if it's elected or hereditary. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Librarian Crazy. And Librarian Crazy says, I've always had conviction in Buddha Dhamma, but there is two things I'm having doubt about. One is, why is in the sutta all past historical Buddhas always born in India? I feel like it's weird how there are so many Buddhas, but they always seem to be born in 500 BC Indian culture. And two, in Digha Nikaya 26, Chakavati Sutta, Buddha mentions some past civilization where people live up to 50,000 years old. I found this odd as we have no evidence of this at all. Okay, there's another part here, but I think that's a different question. So I would just say to Librarian Crazy, first of all, I mean, with regard to this first part, why are all past historical Buddhas born into Iron Age, Ganges Valley Indian culture? I don't think that the Buddha was teaching about past Buddhas. I think that was a sort of devotional, like a mythos that arose after the Buddha's time by people who only knew Indian culture. It's like India at that time, for the people in India in the Buddhist time, it was a continent of Jambudvipa. And you had the Himalayan mountains to the north. There might have been, I mean, they had to acknowledge that there was some kind of inhabited lands farther west, like Persia, but that was all part of Jambudvipa, according to them. There were some other islands, and then to the far north and and to the far east and far west, there were these different continents that I'm pretty sure were not inhabited by humans. They were inhabited by like yakas or nagas or something. I mean, I never had much interest in this kind of thing, but that's really all they knew. It's just the limitations of their imagination. They could not imagine like modern Western culture or even ancient Roman culture. All they knew was India, and so they just had this cycle, this eternal cycle of one India after another, after another, after another, and it never got modern or anything. It was just, essentially the same culture they were in. That didn't really change very fast. I mean, India of 500 years ago wasn't all that much different from India of 700 years ago or 300 years ago. I mean, most of it was pretty much the same. There were some changes, but yeah, it was fairly stable, and they just assumed that's just the way it was. So yeah, I mean, it was just the limitations. I've talked about this before, like I think the video I did before this one, I was talking about just like why the gods seem to have human intelligence. I mean, there's no like gods with intelligence just vastly beyond ours with regard to like IQ and reasoning capacity and so forth. They'll have like powers where they can do things and might see 1,000 worlds simultaneously, but once they start talking, they're talking like a person of more or less average intelligence. So, I mean, that also is just the people who are coming up with the myth, they've got the limitations of their own imagination, what they're capable of imagining, and that's just the way it turned out. I really, anyone who's seen a number of my videos knows that I do not consider everything in the Dipitaka to be 100% accurate historical documents. That probably more than half of it was like conceived later on after the Buddhist time, and not always even by monks who were particularly enlightened. So with regard to the second part here, in Digha Nikaya 26, the Chakravarti Sutta, Buddha mentions some past civilization where people lived up to 50,000 years old. I found this odd as we have no evidence of this at all. Yeah, well, I don't think there is any evidence of it, and I'm rather skeptical that there has ever been a civilization on this planet of human beings living up to 50,000 years. It's just that according to Buddhist cosmology, we don't evolve up from pond slime, up through worms and fish and amphibians and reptiles and lower mammals and monkeys and apes and humans, which is what science teaches nowadays mostly. Good old Charles Darwin, that Buddhist cosmology has us coming downwards. We're degenerating from godlike beings. And I do have a degree in biology, and I do think that there's a lot of good evidence supporting Charles Darwin's point of view. I mean, in general outline, it's pretty obvious that evolution has occurred regardless of how it actually happens. But yeah, and there really is very little. Maybe somebody like Graham Hancock could come up with some kind of evidence that would not be accepted by, the consensus of the scientific community, that there was some past civilization where people were godlike and lived 50,000 years. So this also is just it's ancient Indian mythology that gets incorporated into the texts, and I don't think the Buddha himself was teaching it unless he was just going along with his culture and just repeating what was already, circling around, circulating. But I do think it was probably it did not originate with Gautama Buddha himself, even though it's coming out of his mouth in the sutta. But you can find all kinds of things coming out of the mouths of all kinds of religious founders that they never said, except for maybe Islam, because that's pretty relatively recent and kind of reliable, that probably almost all of that was channeled through Muhammad. If you don't mind me saying it, the Quran was channeled. Okay, so I'll just move on to Librarian Crazy's next question here. Also, how do monks deal with lust and annoyance towards insects like mosquitoes and flies? I think lustful desire in insects might be the biggest problem for me if I ever became a monk, especially an ascetic monk. Yeah, lust and insects, they were troubles for me too. In fact, for a long time, I would not slap a mosquito or anything like that. And then I started trying, ironically, when I was trying to just go full blast and just living out in the woods. I was living under this rock ledge at the edge of a national park in Burma. And it wasn't just mosquitoes, including Anopheles mosquitoes, because I got malaria there every time I went there. It was like they were like sand flies or something that, they hurt and they come in swarms. And I just could not sit there and let myself get bitten by a sandfly or like a horse fly. I just cannot sit there and put up with it. So I eventually started smashing the little bastards. But I tried to compensate. I knew it wasn't good, but everyone has their limits. And just sitting there being eaten alive by these, blood sucking or blood licking flies. Because I think a horsefly, they just slice your skin, and then when the blood comes up, they start licking it. I don't think they actually suck, no, at least not in a literal sense. So I tried to make up for a little bit by feeding antlions. If I'd smash one of these sandflies, that they were just awful too. That I would at least put it into one of these little antlion pits and feed a hungry antlion larva. So at least I'd get a little bit of merit in addition to the demerit of squishing a fly. But again, I don't consider flies. This isn't Buddhism. This is more biology. I don't think insects really feel pain. That they're sort of like little terminators or something. And lust, it's mainly you just have to be mindful, and you just have to have this kind of reflex of no, not appropriate, not going there, no. And you have to have really strong faith and very, very strong commitment and determination to really succeed with that, unless you just have a weak libido. So, yeah, I mean, you just have to cultivate self-restraint and patience. Like a monk he has to be like patient, not only with the biting insects and the lust, but also with hunger and thirst and heat and cold and sickness and, whatever the universe throws at you. If you're a good monk, especially a wise one, you just accept it like a stoic, maybe even better than a stoic. So it takes self-discipline, and meditation helps, mindfulness practice helps, and at least you can make progress in that direction. Although it may be that you'll never stop being lustful until maybe you're 70 or 80, and it may be that you'll never be able to just sit there and be bitten by horseflies. That you'll eventually just get under a mosquito net or move to some place where you've got like walls and a roof and stuff that'll protect you, that'll shelter you from the little parasitic bastards. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Rick. And we've been up to almost 2 hours. Yeah, I might have to start doing these once a week. Rick says, can you elaborate on traveling as a monk? Do you have to ask permission from anyone? How do you go about traveling to different monasteries, wandering around cities or forests, navigating modern world with no money? Do you have to be a monk for a certain amount of time before you can travel? Well, that's kind of an interesting question. With regard to asking permission, there's a rule in the Patimokkha, a Pachitya rule, saying that if you're going to go out into public after noon. Like in the morning, you can just walk into the village and go for alms without asking permission. But if you're going to go after the morning, like in the afternoon or the evening or whatever, you have to go to another monk at the monastery and say, "Wikale gama poisanam apuchami," which means I ask permission to go into the village at the wrong time, which is after the morning alms round time. But aside from that, I mean, especially if you're not living in dependence on a teacher, which is generally after five years or 5 rainy seasons, then I mean you're pretty much a free agent and can go where you like. And if you're living alone, you don't have anyone to ask. You don't have to ask. So how do you go about traveling to different monasteries? It depends. I mean, walking in the tropics for a Westerner doesn't work so good. That's the way it was pretty much always done in ancient times. Ancient India, you just walked. The Buddha himself just walked all over the Ganges Valley. I mean, you might get in a boat to cross a river or something, like a ferry or something. But I mean, there's cars. I mean, if you need a ticket, usually a generous layperson will donate a ticket somewhere, whether a bus ticket or a plane ticket or whatever. Wandering around cities, yeah, you generally want a temple or something. I never really saw monks sleeping on sidewalks like homeless people in San Francisco or any number of other cities in the USA nowadays. Navigating the modern world with no money, I did it. I mean, it is possible. I can tell you that from experience. Sometimes it was dicey, like especially I got trapped in Bali in Indonesia a couple times at the airport because an American citizen doesn't need a visa to get into the country, but you have to buy one at the airport for $30. And I didn't have money. And you can't have the supporters come into that area to pay for your visa just because, I mean, you haven't gone through customs and stuff yet. You have to get the visa first, then go through customs, and then you can meet the people waiting to pick you up. And I got trapped that way twice. And it's nerve-wracking. Or one time I'm at this airport, I give them my ticket paper. It's not like a real ticket anymore. It's just like this computer printout thing. And, the nice little Asian lady types in the number into the computer and frowns and types it in again. And then she calls over the manager and says something in a language I don't understand, and he types it in, and they're all frowning and saying stuff I don't understand. I'm just going, oh man, I'm in trouble. And it turned out that the ticket was reserved and everything. It just, for some reason, it never got activated. So I had to call the travel agent lady to like call them and tell them that, I mean, it's been paid for and everything. So that kind of thing can happen. And you may have to fast if nobody's going to offer you a meal. Um, but I mean, it can be done. And I've done it lots of times. I've traveled lots of places with zero money. But I mean, generally, you have to have someone who is waiting to pick you up. Um, I mean, in America, it is more difficult. I've had to sleep on a bench in Seattle one night just because there was like this layover at the train station. You can't sleep at the train station, they close it. And so I'm just sitting on a bench all night, just in the drizzle. It was not good. But I mean, I survived, obviously. So, see, do you have to be a monk for a certain amount of time before you travel? Not really, so long as you get permission from your teacher if you have a teacher. So I'll just move on to Rick's next question. Can you describe your experience of wearing the robes, comfort, practicality, sleeping, etc.? Well, they're fairly comfortable. I mean, if you're just wearing a lower robe, you're freeballing it, which is comfortable. Practicality, not so much, because I mean, the Burmese monks, they know how to like tie their upper robe around themselves in a certain way, like a vest. They use like their waistband to hold it in place, and then they can do work. But monks' robes simply were not designed to do physical work. I mean, I'd be trying to just sweep the leaves with the bamboo broom, and I just have to go shirtless. I'd just go bare chested. Inside the monastery, it's okay anyway, just because the robe would just keep slipping off and just getting loose, and it was just a pain. Sleeping, yeah, I would just take it off. I mean, you might sleep with a lower robe. You might use your upper robe as a sheet and just cover yourself like a blanket or something. So that's no problem. But you get used to it. I mean, you can get used to anything. It's like going up and down ladders when you got like this long skirt thing. There are certain things you have to learn. Like one of the first things a monk has to learn, like a Western monk who's not used to wearing monk's robes. I mean, before you learn how to meditate, before you learn how to follow the rules of discipline, you have to learn how to sit down without exposing yourself. That's important. But I mean, after a while, you get used to it. It's no problem. So we'll just move on to Rick's next question. How does a monk get things like sandals or dental floss? Well, if you're living in a monastery that has extra sandals, you can get one there. Generally, I mean, even in the ancient rules of monastic discipline, there's like the storekeeper for the monastery has his duties, and if a monk needs sandals, you give him sandals. If you've got sandals, extra sandals in the storeroom. But aside from that, as a general rule, if you're living in a Buddhist culture or you're living with supporters, monks have to live around supporters. You can't just go solo as a monk. You have to live, independence on lay people. And so, if you've got a lay person who has told you, I'll support you if you need something, let me know, Venerable Sir, then you say, I need some sandals or I need some dental floss, and then they donate it to you, and then they get merit and they're happy. And if they gave you what you wanted, the monk tends to be happy too. Although, as a monk, especially if you're living in Asia or something, you just have to get used to not getting what you ask for. You ask for one thing, you get something entirely different. You don't complain about it. You don't chew them out for getting you the wrong thing. I mean, you just swallow it. It's, okay, thank you. Or you're not even supposed to thank people because they're not doing it for thanks. They're doing it for merit. In Thailand, especially, I've heard that people can actually get upset if a Western monk naively thanks them for giving them something. Because again, they're not doing it for thanks. They're not wanting their reward in this life. They want their reward in the next life. So, next question from Rick. There are Buddhists who don't meditate and meditators who are not Buddhists. Can you talk about the role and importance of meditation in Buddhism? Well, that's like a huge topic. And I'm going to have to sort of skim over the surface of this one a little bit. But the role and importance of meditation in Buddhism, well, in Buddhism, it is assumed that you become enlightened through meditation. I mean, it might just be through just being mindful of every moment while you're moving around during the daytime. That counts as meditation too. That's mindfulness practice, satipatthana. But I mean, the Buddha became enlightened through meditation. He taught meditation, encouraged others to meditate. Samadhi is the eighth step in the Noble Eightfold Path. Right concentration, sometimes translated as right meditation. Right mindfulness is also in there. Right effort, which is like, which includes meditative effort. So, yeah, there are meditators who are not Buddhists, although a lot of them might be practicing. Some of them might be practicing valid meditation techniques. I hope most of them. Others might just be like hypnotizing themselves and thinking that they're attaining something because they're seeing all this wild, interesting stuff and thinking they're really getting something when it's like subconscious, self, like auto suggestion or something, and a vivid imagination. So can I talk about the role and importance of meditation in Buddhism? Well, yeah, it's part of the Eightfold Path. First you need sila. This is like the sort of the Holy Trinity, sila, samadhi, panya. So first you have morality, in which sort of calms the mind. It sets the ground, it calms your mind enough that then you can take it in the next step in just like completely getting a flat calm going with your mind, which is samadhi. So sila is morality, leads to a blameless, simple life, peace of mind, relatively speaking. And then samadhi comes next, which is concentration. And according to Orthodox Theravada, you can't have purity of mind without having purity of morals first. I'm not so sure about that, but that's what they say. And then finally, if you've got purity of mind, which at the highest level would be fourth jhana, which is a very advanced meditative state, then you have purity of wisdom, which is enlightenment. So there are some suttas that actually suggest, even if they don't just flat out just blurt it out, that fourth jhana, the highest jhana level, like as high as you can go through meditation, at least in the older suttas, that's like the jumping off point to Nibbana. And in fact, jhana is called like temporary liberation. It may be that some people, like Ramana Maharshi or Eckhart Tolle, became enlightened without meditating, but a Buddhist would say, well, they had parami, they meditated a lot in a previous life, and I don't think either one of them would have denied that they meditated a lot in a previous life until they just got right to the point where they were just really ripe, like the yellow leaf getting ready to fall off the tree, all it took was just a little nudge and that was it. So yeah, meditation is considered to be essential for enlightenment in Buddhism. It's not essential to be a Buddhist because you can just be a layperson who keeps 5 precepts and supports your aging parents and takes good care of your family and has a right livelihood. You make an honest living and you love your neighbor, you tell the truth and you don't steal and all that. You're doing good. But if you want full enlightenment, according to Theravada Buddhism, then you're going to have to meditate. And if you somehow manage it without meditating, it's because you meditated a hell of a lot in a previous existence. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Mary, spelled M-E-R-R-Y, who briefly was known as Brave Sir Robin, but now has gone back to Mary again. And Mary says, is Tibetan Buddhism really Buddhism or some sort of shamanism with Buddhist elements? I have my opinion on this. It's a combination of, you can look at it either way. Is the cup half full or half empty? Is Tibetan Buddhism with lots of shamanism added, or is it shamanism with lots of Buddhism added? I'm willing to be generous and call it a kind of Buddhism, but it's not pure ancient Orthodox Indian Buddhism. It was some sort of there's a lot of Majamaka in it. I think the Gelugpa sect that the Dalai Lama follows looks back to Nagarjuna, presumably the founder of the Majamaka school of Mahayana Buddhism, as sort of their spiritual father, like the first patriarch in their lineage or something. And then that sort of evolved into, it adopted a lot of weird tantric elements. It was getting very esoteric. All kinds of weird stuff was being added even before it got to Tibet. And then when it got to Tibet, there was already the Bon, or like a shamanistic religious system or spiritual system or just shamanistic system going there. And of course, when Buddhism goes to any culture, it's going to adopt, elements of that culture. It's just invariable. It's going to happen in any culture. So, I mean, if you're generous, I mean, you want to call it Buddhism. I mean, most people do, Tibetan Buddhism. So yeah, it's definitely got Buddhist elements. I mean, you want to call it, is it more than 50% Buddhism? Is it only 49% Buddhism? I would say it's probably more than 50% Buddhism as like an Indian import. But I mean, the Buddhism that was imported into Tibet from India was already a lot of it was this esoteric tantric kind of stuff before it even got to Tibet. So if you want to be a hard ass, you don't want to accept even Mahayana as real Buddhism, or Pure Land or something, then it's just a matter of opinion, I think. I don't think there's any just litmus test to tell for sure, just objectively, whether something really is Buddhism or not. I remember reading a long time ago that there was some American Buddhist Congress convention back in like the late 80s, and they were trying to determine what is a Buddhist, and they couldn't agree. The best they could come up with is a Buddhist is anyone who considers themselves to be a Buddhist. Of course, this was in the West, where you got a lot of lefties who are just sort of relativists anyway. So yeah, it's just a matter of opinion. So I'll just move on to Mary's next question. And by golly, I get caught by surprise by these. This is the very last question. This is the last of all the questions. I thought I was only like 2/3 of the way through. I'm thinking, man, this is going to be 3 hours long. Boom! Very last question here. From Mary, spelled Merry. Background story of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, is almost identical as that of the Buddha. He was a prince. He left his palace and family around the age of 30. He wandered as an ascetic for many years, and then he became enlightened and found a unique way of life and way to nirvana. And for the next 30 years, he did teach this way. Question: could Buddha's story have been just copied from that of Mahavira because Jainism is earlier? Well, that's an interesting question. And yeah, I have read some old Jain scriptures, old Jain sutras or suttas. It's the Jain texts are in a kind of Prakrit that isn't Sanskrit, and it's not Pali. So I can't remember if it's sutta or sutra. But yeah, the biography, the sort of legend of Mahavira, it's almost the same as that of Gautama Buddha, except he didn't cut off his hair and beard. He actually ripped them out by the roots. I think it was 8 handfuls, or just this certain like magical number of handfuls that he ripped out all of his head and facial hair. But I think it's more likely to be the other way around, where the Jains copied the Buddhists in this. Otherwise, it's some sort of archetype that they just through this weird coincidence, Mahavira, the founder of the Jains, and Gautama Buddha, the founder of Buddhism, they both had essentially the same kind of life leading up to their renunciation, and just a lot of the same actions, even when they were striving towards enlightenment. Because if you read the Buddhist text, the Buddha himself was like a hardcore ascetic, he went mute, he'd go around naked, he'd eat cow poop and stuff. He just all these things that Mahavira also presumably did. And so it does seem kind of suspicious that both of them would live essentially the same life up until they become enlightened. And I do think that it's more likely that the Jains copied from the Buddhists because the Jains were such ascetics. They didn't have many scholars, and they lost their scriptures twice. That the monks were so much into just going out in the forest and torturing themselves or whatever, wandering around naked, smearing themselves with mud to keep from freezing to death in the wintertime, that, they just didn't have schools like the Buddhists had. They were too ascetic for that. And so they didn't have their scriptures written down, which was Indian tradition in ancient times. The Buddhists didn't have their scriptures written down until, what was it, at least 500 years after the death of the Buddha, that finally the Tipitaka was written down. And the Jains were the same way, but they didn't have as many scholars because they were hardcore ascetics. They were out torturing themselves. And so they just lost their scriptures. And so they had to have a convention where they get back together and like reformulate. You know, they'd still have fragments that they would like edit together and maybe add some new stuff. And that happened twice. So I think it is more likely that the striking resemblance between the story of Mahavira and the story of Gautama are because the Jains copied the Buddhists rather than the other way around. And I mean, the story of the Buddha is well maintained from relatively very ancient times. I mean, there is some mythology added, but by even the mythology itself was pretty much settled within like 100 years after the time of the Buddha. And that is older than the latest recension of the Jainist texts. So yeah, I'm just going with the evidence and just sort of some Occam's razor and common sense. I'd say that probably the Jains borrowed the legend of the Buddha for the biography of their own founder, just because they lost so much of their own traditions because it wasn't written down, and their monks just weren't as scholarly because they were just moving in a different direction than the Buddhists to some degree. I mean, they were just more just extreme ascetics that they just borrowed it from the Buddhists. So that's it. That's the last question. By golly, I get caught by surprise by the last question a lot of the time. So if you have any questions, you are very welcome to leave them in the comments below. And if I get lots and lots of questions, I'll just have to start doing these more often. And please subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the like button if you haven't already, and look at the URL links, and be happy.